Wet hay, cheap tallow, and the sour bite of unwashed wool. That was the smell of a woman with nothing left to lose. Maren Cobb had no business standing inside the Duke of Eastmore's private paddock, her boots sinking past the ankle in frozen muck, her eyes fixed on a horse that had already cracked the bones of 2 grown men. She was not there for pride. She was there for 45 guineas folded inside a nobleman's coat pocket, and for a chance at a job that would keep her family fed through the winter. The terms were simple: stay seated in the saddle for 3 full minutes. She intended to do a great deal more than simply survive it. Before this story drags you the rest of the way into the cold and the blood and the horse nobody else would touch, if you already know you are the kind of person who roots for the underdog every single time, go ahead and tap follow right now, because you do not want this one sliding out of your feed before you reach the wall. Her hands were rough, the skin split at the knuckles from years of honest, unglamorous labor, and she pressed them deeper into the pockets of an oversized coat she had tied at her waist with a length of old twine. Eastmore Hall rose behind her, vast and grey and silent, the kind of building that swallowed sound whole. It smelled of damp stone and pipe smoke, and the particular heaviness of old money, and to Maren it smelled like a door finally cracked open. Her left boot had a hole in the sole, and icy water had already worked its way through to her toes. But she had learned long ago not to complain about cold feet when the rent was 3 weeks late, and the landlord had taken to loitering near her door at dusk, smiling the way men smiled when they thought they had found a new kind of leverage. Across the yard, Coram Wyatt, the head groom of Eastmore Hall, was polishing a bit with a cloth that looked cleaner than anything Maren owned. He did not look up at her. He had already told her once that morning that she was wasting her breath. His Grace does not hire women, he had said, and he certainly does not hire strangers wandering in off the Lowmarsh Road. Maren had not left. She had stood her ground like a fence post driven into frozen earth, shoulders pulled tight against the wind, watching the heavy doors of the main house. When Julian Hartley, the Duke of Eastmore, finally stepped outside, he did not move like a man who enjoyed being looked at. He moved like a man who found the entire world faintly exhausting. He was tall, with a slight stoop to his shoulders, as though the weight of his own title had begun to bend his spine years ago. His coat was the kind of dark, perfectly cut wool that looked as though it had been poured onto him, rather than sewn, and his boots were so clean they caught what little light there was. He did not notice her at first. There was no reason he should have. She was a smear of brown and grey against a stable wall. "Wyatt," Julian said, his voice low and rougher than Maren had expected from a man who likely had a servant just to press his newspaper flat. "Tell me the farrier has not pushed us back again." "Tomorrow morning, Your Grace," Wyatt answered, dropping his cloth and touching the brim of his cap. "The roads past the toll bridge are still washed out." Julian let out a slow breath through his nose. He drew a silver case from his pocket and snapped it open with a sharp metallic click that made one of the nearby horses flick its ears. He took out a thin cigar, set it between his teeth, and struck a match, the smell of sulphur cutting through the wet morning air. It was the small flare of that match that caught his eye, and he turned, the flame burning down dangerously close to his glove, before he finally shook it out and dropped it into a puddle. "Wyatt," he said, "why is there a child standing in my yard?" "Not a child, Your Grace," Maren said. Her voice came out cracked, since she had not used it since sunrise. She cleared her throat, tasting copper and cold air, and tried again. "I am 23, and I have come about the breaker's position." Julian looked at her the way a man might look at a stray cat that had wandered into a banquet hall, not curious, not unkind exactly, simply blank. His eyes moved over her battered hat, the man's coat far too large for her frame and the mud caked thick on her shins. "I do not run a charity," he said, already turning back toward his groom. "Send her to the kitchens if she needs feeding, then put her back on the road." "I do not want soup," Maren snapped, her hands curling into fists inside her pockets. The flash of anger felt good, warm against the cold sitting in her chest. I have heard you sent your last 2 breakers packing. I have heard you have a yard full of green horses and 1 stall nobody dares open." Julian stopped walking. He turned slowly, the thin cigar still clenched between his teeth, a curl of smoke drifting past his eye. "You have heard," he repeated. "Yes. From whom?" "From men in the taverns down in the village, talking with their arms still bound up in slings." Maren held his stare. Her stomach was twisted into a hard, anxious knot, but she did not let her gaze drop. "I can sit anything in this yard," she said. "I have softer hands than your grooms, and I do not quit just because the ground comes up to meet me." Wyatt let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "Your Grace, she showed up before dawn asking for you by name. The girl is touched in the head." Julian pulled the cigar from his mouth and studied Maren again, longer this time. This look was heavier, the look of a man who lived by ledgers and probability and saw nothing in front of him but a poor wager. "What do you weigh?" he asked. 7 stone, 8. "You do not have the body to hold a cart horse steady, let alone stay on a half-wild hunter. Go home before you get yourself killed on my land and leave me to deal with the paperwork." He turned to walk away. The chance was slipping through her fingers like water through a cracked jug. "I heard about the grey," Maren called after him, loud enough that it echoed off the stable wall. Julian froze mid-stride. His shoulders went rigid. Wyatt hissed under his breath, "Hold your tongue, girl." Maren stepped forward anyway, boots squelching through the mud. "I heard you bought a grey hunter at auction, paid a small fortune for him, and I heard he has already put 3 of your men flat on their backs, and that nobody has managed to put a saddle on him in a month." Julian turned back around fully now. His jaw had gone tight, and whatever boredom had been sitting in his eyes a moment ago had hardened into something colder. "Is that so?" he murmured, walking toward her. Up close, he smelled of cedar and tobacco smoke, and there were shadows under his eyes that no amount of fine tailoring could hide. He did not look like a pampered lord. He looked like a man who had not slept properly in weeks. "Yes," Maren said, lifting her chin. "You are keeping him shut away in the back of the yard, burning through feed for nothing, because your pride will not let you sell him at a loss, and your men are too frightened to even open his door." Julian studied her for a long moment. The wind rattled a loose shingle somewhere above them, and neither of them spoke. "You think this is pride?" he asked at last, his voice quiet. "I think it is poor management," Maren answered. 45 guineas. That is what you would pay a breaker. I will sit your grey. If I manage it, you pay me the money and you give me the position." Julian laughed, a short, humorless sound. "And if he breaks your ribs, then you can leave me by the side of the road, and it will not be your trouble any longer." Julian looked once at Wyatt, then back at her. He dropped his cigar into the mud and crushed it slowly beneath his heel. "Very well," he said, and the words fell like a stone dropped down a well. "If you want to risk your neck for 45 guineas, I will not be the one to stop you." The walk toward the old isolation stalls felt like being marched to a gallows. Maren followed the Duke and his groom past the main row of stables, away from the warmth of the working horses, into the older part of the estate where the stone walls pressed in close and the cold seemed to settle deeper into the bone. Weeds had pushed up through the cobbles back here. Nobody came this way unless they absolutely had to. Her courage was already thinning with every step. Her knees trembled faintly beneath her skirts. 45 guineas was a fortune to her, enough for a season of coal, enough for the medicine her father's chest needed, enough to finally breathe without counting every coin twice. It was survival, plain and simple. But then the sharp sting of ammonia hit her nose, and the weight of what she had agreed to settled hard in her stomach. They stopped before a heavy oak door reinforced with black iron bands, the top half latched shut so no light could enter. Deep gouges scarred the wood from the outside, as though something inside had tried for a long time to kick its way free. "His name is Tempest," Julian said, standing a few paces back, with his hands clasped behind him, watching her face closely for the hesitation he expected to find there. "The men call him the Reaper. He is an Irish-bred hunter, taller than 16 hands, and built almost entirely out of fury." Maren stared at the scarred door. From inside came a sound that turned her stomach, a low rumbling groan followed by the heavy rhythmic thud of a massive hoof striking the straw again and again. It did not sound like a horse. It sounded like something pacing a cage. "Why did you buy him?" Maren asked, her voice quieter now. "He cleared a 6-foot ditch out hunting in the eastern counties," Julian said dryly. "He went over it like he had wings. I wanted a horse that could clear the old boundary wall on the south edge of my land. No horse has ever managed it, and the day after I paid for him, he decided he had no further interest in tolerating a rider, not if crushing one against a wall was an option." He motioned toward the door. "He is yours to saddle. Wyatt will not assist you. I will not assist you. If you cry out, Wyatt will pull you free, but the wager is forfeited the moment that happens." Maren licked her lips, tasting salt and dust. She looked at Wyatt, who held out a stiff leather halter and lead rope, his expression somewhere between pity and resignation. She took it from him. The leather was cold and unyielding in her hands. "Backing out already?" Julian asked. "There would be no shame in it. He has killed before. Or near enough." Maren looked up at him. She saw the absolute certainty written across his face, the certainty that she would fail just as everyone before her had failed, because he lived in a world where every problem could be solved with enough money or simply locked behind a heavy door and forgotten. She lived in a different world entirely, one where you either faced the danger directly or you starved slowly instead. "I will need a bucket of feed," Maren said to Wyatt, and opened the top of that door. "Let some light in." Wyatt hesitated, glancing at Julian, who gave a short nod. The groom unlatched the upper half of the door and swung it wide. Dust spun in the sudden grey shaft of daylight, and a massive head lunged straight at the opening. Maren stumbled back. The horse was enormous, his coat the color of storm clouds, thick with dried mud and sweat because no one had dared to brush him in weeks. His ears had vanished flat against his skull. The whites of his eyes showed all the way around. He snapped his teeth at nothing. The sound like a steel trap closing, then slammed his head against the door frame, hard enough to rattle the hinges, seemingly indifferent to the pain it must have caused him. Maren stared at him, her heart hammered against her ribs, like something trying to break free of a cage of its own. She was afraid, truly afraid, the kind of fear that whispered to drop the rope and run for the gate. But underneath that fear, watching him pace the narrow strip of light, she saw something else entirely. The wild rolling of his eyes was not only rage. It was the same trapped, cornered desperation she felt every time she heard a fist knock against her own front door. He was locked away in the dark. He had been cornered for a long time. 3 minutes, Maren said, her voice shaking slightly. She did not look back at Julian. "If I can even get the halter on him." She slid the lower bolt free. The iron groaned in protest. She pushed the door open and stepped into the gloom, and the smell hit her at once, rotted straw, urine, and the hot metallic stink of a frightened, furious animal. As soon as she shut the lower door behind her, the light dimmed, and the stall felt no bigger than a coffin. In the far corner, Tempest stopped pacing and turned his huge body toward her. The size of him stole the breath right out of her lungs. His chest was a slab of pure muscle, his neck thick and scarred with old bite marks from some long-forgotten herd battle. He lowered his head and went utterly silent. No whinny, no snort, just a focused, deadly stillness. Maren froze, then made herself keep moving. She did not offer her hand for him to sniff. That was a fast way to lose fingers. She kept her hands low, the halter in one, the bucket in the other. "All right, you wretched animal," she whispered, her voice steady even though her hands were not. "I know what they have done to you. I know you have no reason to trust a single soul in this yard." Tempest lunged. It happened faster than thought, 1,500 pounds of muscle exploding toward her. Maren reacted purely on instinct, throwing herself sideways and slamming her shoulder hard against the stone wall, pain flaring bright down her collarbone. His teeth snapped shut on empty air, exactly where her face had been a heartbeat earlier. His shoulder clipped her coat as he spun to kick, and she shoved the heavy bucket of feed straight into his hind quarters, the wood cracking against bone. He startled, kicking out wildly, and the bucket shattered, sending grain exploding across the filthy straw in a pale cloud. Maren did not retreat toward the door. Retreat meant becoming prey. She pushed forward instead, stepping directly into the space beside him, grabbing a fistful of his thick tangled mane up near the withers, where his teeth and hooves could not easily reach her. He threw his head up, lifting her clean off her feet for a moment, her boots scrambling for purchase in the muck, her bruised shoulder screaming, but she held on, twisting her fist deeper into the coarse hair. Enough, she barked, putting every ounce of authority she had into the single word. It was not a soft plea, it was a command. The horse went rigid. He trembled violently, his skin twitching beneath her knuckles, waiting, she realized, for the whip for the shouting men with pitchforks who had likely beaten him into this state in the first place. Instead, she simply stood there, breathing hard, holding his mane. She did not strike him. She only anchored herself to him and let the silence stretch out between them, broken only by his ragged breathing and her own. Sweat trickled cold down the back of her neck. The mane under her fingers was greasy and stiff with old dirt. Slowly, with great care, she slid her free hand up along his neck. He flinched, ears pinning flat again, but she did not pull away. "No," she said firmly, and kept her hand pressed there, a steady, warm, unmoving weight. Through the gap in the upper door, she could hear Wyatt muttering something to the Duke. She ignored them both. The world outside this narrow stall might as well not have existed. There was only the heat of the animal beneath her palm, the stink of ammonia, and the rhythm of two hearts beating too fast. It took nearly 10 minutes to finally work the halter over his ears. Every time the leather shifted, he jerked away, dragging her with him, her knuckles scraping raw against the stone. She bled onto the strap and did not stop. When the buckle finally clicked shut, Maren dropped her forehead against his shoulder and simply breathed, exhausted, and she had not even managed to lead him out of the stall yet. "All right," she murmured, gathering the rope. "Let us go show his grace how a man should actually treat a horse." She kicked the lower latch open and stepped out into the grey light of the yard, looking, she imagined, like she had just survived a brawl. Blood and dirt smeared one cheek where her torn knuckles had brushed it. Her coat was coated in feed and filth. She limped slightly from the impact against the wall. Behind her, at the end of the taut rope, came the beast himself. Tempest stepped out of the stall, the light catching the storm grey of his coat, and the coiled tension still trembling through every muscle. He flung his head once, hard enough to lift Maren briefly onto her toes, but she did not release the rope. She hauled it back sharply. "Walk," she snapped. The horse let out a wet, rattling snort, but he stepped forward. Julian Hartley had not moved from where she had left him. The boredom had drained entirely from his face. His dark eyes tracked her slow, limping progress across the stones, moving from her bleeding knuckles up to the wild, rolling eyes of the animal behind her. "Bring a saddle, Mr. Wyatt." Maren called, her voice rough but carrying clearly across the cold air. She did not stop walking until she reached the center of the yard, the horse's hot breath blowing against the back of her neck. She looked straight at the Duke. "And see that the girth is not rotted through. I have no intention of dying because somebody neglected your tack room the same way they neglected your horses." Julian's jaw worked. For the first time that morning, the faint edge of a smile pulled at one corner of his mouth. "Bring her the heavy saddle, Wyatt," he said softly, stepping closer, his boots somehow still spotless against the mud. "Let us see if she can keep her seat." Wyatt dropped the saddle onto the fence rail with a heavy, dead thud. It was a brutal thing, thick, unforgiving leather and brass fittings, built for a man expecting to ride through cannon fire rather than across a tidy English paddock. It smelled of old tallow and disuse. Maren tied Tempest to the iron ring set into the central post, leaving no slack for him to twist around and bite her. He stood with his legs splayed, every muscle along his flank twitching like exposed nerve, sweating despite the bitter cold lather already gathering at his neck and between his hind legs. "You will need a leg up," Wyatt said, keeping a careful distance, holding the girth strap as though it might bite him. "Personally, if you touch me, he will explode," Maren said, her voice tight, her hands aching where the skin had peeled away. "Slide the saddle over slowly." Julian watched from the edge of the muck without moving, his coat perfectly still despite the wind, his eyes tracking her every motion. He had seen strong men twice her size, thrown like discarded dolls by this same animal. He found himself oddly fascinated by her sheer, stubborn refusal to be reasonable. She was shivering, her coat soaked through at the hem, favoring her right shoulder as she lifted the heavy leather. She was no hero out of a storybook. She was a desperate woman with nothing left to lose, and in his experience, desperation usually ended in disaster. Maren hoisted the saddle. It was absurdly heavy. Pain shot bright down her bruised collarbone, but she clenched her jaw and bit the inside of her cheek until she tasted copper and let the saddle hover for a single breath before lowering it gently onto his back. Tempest flinched hard, dropping his spine and scrambling sideways, his iron shoes striking sparks against the cobbles. Maren did not step back. She stayed pressed to his shoulder, moving with him, her grip locked on the halter. "Easy," she breathed, utterly out of air. "Easy, you miserable beast." She reached beneath his belly for the girth, the stink of hot, angry horse filling her lungs, sharp and musky. Her fingers brushed coarse hair, and he snapped a hind leg forward in a vicious cow kick aimed straight at her ribs. She caught the motion at the edge of her vision and drove her elbow hard into his side before the hoof could land, just enough to throw his balance. He scrambled, stamping his foot down with an angry snort, and she snatched the strap and shoved the buckle through the first hole. He immediately swelled his belly with air, an old trick meant to keep the girth loose. Maren leaned her forehead briefly against his sweaty shoulder, eyes closed, legs feeling almost hollow with fatigue. "Wyatt," Julian's voice cut through the cold. "Tell me we have a physician within reach. Dr. Pemberton is down in the village, Your Grace, an hour's ride at best." "Then we shall need a cart to bring her back," Julian said dryly. Maren's eyes snapped open and a fresh hot spark of anger burned away her exhaustion. She drove her knee sharply into the horse's swollen belly. He exhaled with an indignant grunt, and in that single second of deflation, she hauled the strap up 3 more holes and cinched it tight. The buckle pinched her thumb hard enough to draw blood, but she ignored it. The saddle was secure. She stepped back. The horse stood frozen, ears pinned flat, eyes still rimmed white, looking like a keg of powder, waiting on a spark. 3 minutes, Maren said, turning just enough to look at the Duke. Her chest heaved. The smear of dirt and blood on her face made her look half feral. "Have Wyatt time it properly." Julian reached slowly into his waistcoat and drew out a gold pocket watch, the chain catching the dull light as he clicked it open. "The instant your weight settles into that stirrup," he said, his voice losing its usual dry edge. "If you come off, do not try to stand. Roll for the fence. He will try to trample you given the chance." Maren did not answer. She turned back to the horse. She could not mount from the ground, not on an animal this tall, not with legs too short to reach the stirrup without bouncing, which would only set him off faster. Instead, she climbed the bottom rail of the fence and balanced there above the mud. Tempest watched her, his head turning slightly, the whites of his eyes glowing in the grey light. She gathered the reins into one hand, wrapped them tightly enough that they could not slip, and grabbed a fistful of mane with the other. She did not pray. Prayer had never once kept a landlord from her door, and it was not going to keep this animal from trying to kill her now. She pushed off the rail and swung her leg over. Gravity dropped her into the unforgiving leather seat. For one heartbeat, the entire world went perfectly, terrifyingly still. Wyatt held his breath. Julian stared at the gold watch ticking in his palm. Then the earth seemed to explode beneath her. Tempest did not rear, since rearing was for showing off. He dropped his head between his knees, rounded his spine into a rigid arch, and launched his entire body off the ground. The shock of his hooves striking earth again shattered the silence completely. The force shot straight up Maren's spine, rattling her teeth in her skull. The air punched out of her lungs before she could even gasp. He twisted mid-air, throwing his hindquarters one way while his shoulders slammed the other, a vicious, calculated move, meant to snap a rider loose and throw them straight into the stone wall of the yard. Maren lost her right stirrup instantly, her boot swinging wild. Cold, sharp panic flooded her veins. But she refused to scream. She clamped her thighs against the saddle flaps, muscles screaming in protest, and buried both hands deep in his mane. She became something stubborn and small and impossible to dislodge, a burr caught in his coat. She threw away every scrap of elegant technique she had ever learned. She was not trying to look graceful. She was trying to stay alive. 1 minute, Wyatt shouted over the thunder of hooves, his voice cracking. Tempest hit the ground and immediately charged forward, mud slicking under his hooves, nearly going down to his knees before catching himself and bucking again. Maren's head snapped back. Her hat flew off, swallowed by the muck. The wind tore at her hair, stinging her eyes like needles, and she tasted dirt on her tongue. The world spun past in a violent blur of grey sky and brown earth, and the black timber of the fence rushing closer. He was aiming straight for the rails, intending to scrape her off against the wood. "Pull him up," Julian shouted, stepping forward despite himself, his composure cracking entirely. Pull his head up. She could not pull his head up. She did not have the leverage, 8 stone of body weight against 1,500 pounds of fury. As the fence rushed toward her left side, she did the only thing she could think of, kicking her free foot loose from the stirrup, hauling her leg up onto the saddle pad, and shoving her boot hard against the passing rail. The friction tore the sole half off her boot, but it shoved his shoulders away from the timber, and they careened past with the brass stirrup screeching against the wood. If this story has your pulse up even a little, take 30 seconds right now and drop a comment telling me whether you think she walks away from this ride, because I genuinely want to know what you are thinking before we get to that wall later on. Tempest screamed, a high, furious sound, and abandoned the bucking for spinning instead, planting his front feet and whipping his hind quarters around in tight, dizzying circles. The force tore at Maren's grip. Her fingers, already bleeding, began to slip, smearing red across his grey neck. Her thighs burned and trembled with the strain, and nausea rose thick in her throat. She squeezed her eyes shut and thought of nothing but the money, the rent, the coal, her father's medicine, repeating it like a drumbeat until she found her jaw locking with new resolve. She drove her heel into his side and hauled back hard on one rein, bending his neck around until his nose nearly brushed her knee. Robbed of his balance, Tempest stumbled out of the spin, sides heaving like a bellows. He did not stop fighting, but the bone-jarring buck softened into a stiff, jolting crow, hop around the perimeter of the yard. Every landing was agony in her bruised shoulder, but she stayed in the saddle. 2 minutes, Wyatt called, leaning hard over the fence rail, his face drained of color. Julian stood frozen, watching her. He had seen city soldiers quit on horses far gentler than this within 30 seconds, men who surrendered to pain and fear the moment it became unbearable. This small, half-starved woman with blood on her face and ruined boots simply refused to come off. She was not overpowering the horse. She was outlasting him, matching his stubbornness with her own. The thought struck Julian like a blow. He had spent his whole life surrounded by people who folded the moment money or title pushed against them. He had built a wall of cynicism around himself, certain that everyone eventually broke. This woman was cracking that certainty wide open with every jolt of hooves against frozen ground. Tempest was tiring. The explosive fury was draining out of him, replaced by heavy, sullen exhaustion. His coat had gone black with sweat. He dragged his feet, head hanging low, blowing thick ropes of foam from his lips, until he came to a shuddering halt in the middle of the yard. legs planted wide, sides heaving. Maren did not move. She could not. Her fingers were locked into his mane in a death grip, her muscles cramped solid, her breath coming in jagged, gasping pulls that sounded far too loud in the sudden silence. "Time," Julian said, his voice hoarse, snapping the watch shut with a sharp click. "That is 3 minutes." Maren turned her head slowly, her hair plastered flat against her sweat-soaked forehead, her eyes glazed and her mouth open as she fought for air. She loosened her bleeding fingers from his mane with great care, kicked free of her remaining stirrup, and slid sideways off the saddle. Her boots hit the mud, and her legs gave out completely, and she did not fully fall, catching herself on her hands and knees in the freezing wet ground. She knelt there, coughing, unable to find the strength to stand. Wyatt rushed forward with a lead rope, catching the horse's halter. Tempest did not even flinch. He only dropped his head, thoroughly spent. Footsteps approached, slow and deliberate on the wet stone. Julian stopped in front of her. Maren stared at his boots, splattered now with mud despite all his earlier care. She forced her arms to push her upright until she knelt straight, looking up at him. The boredom was entirely gone from his face. In its place was something sharp, something unsettled. He reached into his coat and drew out a heavy leather purse. He did not hand it down to her. Instead, he knelt in the wet mud himself, ruining the knees of his fine trousers, bringing himself level with her. 45 guineas, he said quietly, pressing the purse into her trembling, bleeding hand. His fingers brushed hers, and they were warm. The breaker's position is yours if you still want it. Maren closed her fist around the leather. The weight of the coins felt heavier than the saddle had. "I will be here at dawn," she rasped. Julian did not smile, but something shifted in the line of his jaw. "I do not doubt it." Morning arrived tasting of old blood and bruised bone. Maren woke before sunrise, her whole body locked rigid. When she tried to push the thin blanket off her chest, her shoulder screamed with a sharp, tearing heat. She lay there a long moment, staring at the water stains on the ceiling, cataloguing the fresh damage. Her ribs throbbed dully. Her thighs felt as though they had been struck with an iron bar. She forced herself upright, and it took 3 attempts. She did not look in the cracked mirror above her wash basin. She already knew what she would find there. Instead, she wrapped clean linen around her torn knuckles, pulled on a stiff, dry pair of trousers, and drank a cup of water that tasted faintly of tin. The purse of guineas sat hidden beneath a loose floorboard. She could have stayed in bed. She could have bought coal and a bottle of something to dull the pain and slept for 3 days straight. But the memory of the Duke, kneeling in the mud, looking at her with something close to genuine respect, would not let her rest. Julian Hartley did not hand out respect freely. He bought people, used them, and discarded them. She walked the 3 miles to Eastmore Hall in the dark. Wyatt was already turning the carriage horses out into the lower field when she limped into the yard. He stopped and stared at her. "You look like something dragged out of a ditch, miss," he said flatly. "A fine morning to you too," Maren grunted, and headed straight for the tack room. She did not ride Tempest that day nor the next. The notion of taming a wild animal with a single triumphant ride belonged in cheap novels, not in reality. Gentling a horse like him was closer to a slow siege, fought in inches through the frozen mud, day after day. Maren spent the first week doing nothing but groundwork in the small round pen, standing at the center with a long line, sending him circling around her again and again. He bucked, he charged. He reared and struck out with his front hooves, the iron shoes whistling past her face more than once. She simply held her ground, snapping the lash behind his hocks, forcing him to keep moving until his lungs burned and his arrogance finally cracked. She demanded his attention. Every time his ears drifted toward the main yard, she popped the whip. "Look at me. Respect this space." It was exhausting, punishing work. Fresh calluses grew over old blisters on her palms. She began to smell permanently of horse sweat and damp wool. On the 8th day, Julian finally came down to the pens. He had been watching her from the library window all week, a silent shape behind heavy velvet curtains, abandoning his ledgers and his correspondence to watch a half-starved woman wage war in the mud. It irritated him deeply. He was a man of numbers and logic, and there was no logic at all in her persistence. The sky hung low and bruised that morning. Julian approached the fence just as Maren brought Tempest to a halt. The horse stood sweating, head low, sides heaving. Maren leaned on the handle of her whip, catching her breath. "You came back," Julian said. Maren did not flinch. "I said I would." "People say a great many things when they are desperate," Julian murmured, leaning his forearms on the top rail. He wore a heavy charcoal coat, collar turned up against the wind. 45 guineas could buy passage to America, or keep you comfortably drunk and fed in London for the better part of a year. "And when that year ends," Maren asked, her voice rough, unclipping the line and letting the horse wander toward the water trough, "I end up exactly where I started. 45 guineas only delays starvation, Your Grace. A wage prevents it entirely." Julian studied her. The bruise along her cheek had faded to a sickly yellow. "You are remarkably practical for a woman who chooses to sit on dynamite for a living. I do not have the luxury of being anything else." Maren walked toward the fence, stopping a few feet from him, acutely aware of the gap between them, the clean soap and rich tobacco scent of him against her own smell of horse and barn. "Is there a reason you have come down here? Or did you simply want to judge my finances?" A faint, genuine smile touched his mouth, and it changed his whole face, smoothing away the cynical lines around his eyes. "I brought you something," he said, reaching into his coat and drawing out a small heavy jar with a metal lid, setting it on the fence post. "Arnica and camphor," he said, "my grandmother's old recipe. It smells dreadful, but it pulls the bruising out of deep muscle better than anything a physician will sell you." Maren stared at the jar without reaching for it. Her stomach gave a strange, tight flutter that had nothing to do with fear. She was used to men offering insults, or pity, or worse. She did not know what to do with quiet, observant kindness from a man who currently held her livelihood in his hands. "Why?" she asked, suspicion creeping into her voice. "Because a crippled breaker is of no use to me," Julian said smoothly, the smile vanishing back behind his usual guarded mask, "and because I find myself oddly invested in watching you win this particular fight. Use it, Cobb." He turned and walked back toward the great house, his boots cutting sharp lines into the frosted earth. Maren watched him go, then finally picked up the jar. The glass was still warm from his pocket. December arrived with teeth. The ground froze solid, turning the paddock into a maze of jagged, ankle-breaking ruts. Tempest had stopped trying to kill her daily, but the truce between them remained fragile. He allowed her to saddle him. He allowed her to ride him out of the yard, but he stayed coiled tight as a spring, and every shadow, every snapping twig in the trees, sent him dropping his hindquarters, ready to bolt. He did not want to walk quietly. He wanted to run until his own heart gave out. "He needs proper work," Maren told Julian one morning, standing in the main barn while the smell of warm bran mash hung thick in the air. "He is bored. Groundwork alone is not enough anymore. He needs open ground to stretch into." Julian was examining the stitching on a bridle and paused. "The ground is frozen solid. If he bolts with you and goes down, he will shatter a leg, and likely break your neck along with it. He will not go down. He knows exactly where his feet are," Maren argued, stepping closer, crowding his space just slightly, a habit she was developing, this small physical pushback against his authority. "You bought him to hunt. You bought him to jump. Keep him boxed inside this yard much longer, and he will lose every ounce of progress we have made." Julian looked down at her, noting again the stubborn set of her jaw and the sharp intelligence behind her eyes. "Fine," he said, "saddle him. I will ride out with you." An hour later they left the estate grounds. Julian rode a tall, dark bay that moved with smooth, arrogant grace, answering his lightest signal. Maren rode the storm. Tempest sidestepped, chewed furiously at his bit, tossed his head, fought her for every inch of rein. He jogged in place, hooves cracking against the frozen road like pistol fire. Marin sat deep, hands low, using her whole body to absorb his frantic energy, her thighs aching within the first mile. Julian watched her from the corner of his eye, half expecting her to snap, to yank at the horse's mouth in frustration. She never did. She kept a steady, patient pressure instead, murmuring low and rough to the animal beneath her. They rode past the bare, skeletal trees of the northern woods, cutting across frost-covered moorland, the wind sharp enough to bite at exposed skin. "Where are we headed?" Marin called, her breath pluming white. "South," Julian answered, pointing with his riding crop. "To the boundary." It took another 20 minutes to reach it. When they broke through a line of dead pines, Marin finally saw it clearly. The boundary wall was no simple pasture fence. It was an old, weathered stretch of massive grey fieldstone running across the moor like a jagged spine, easily 5.5 feet high, completely solid, slick with a layer of frozen moss. There was no forgiving top rail to knock loose. If a horse struck that wall, bone would shatter. Julian pulled his bay to a stop 50 yards out. Marin wrestled Tempest down to a heavy, stamping walk beside him. "There it is," Julian said softly, not looking at her, staring instead at the grey stones with hard, distant eyes. "The edge of Eastmoor land." "It is massive," Marin admitted, studying the approach, the slight uphill slope, the added difficulty of it. "Who builds a wall that tall on open moor?" "My grandfather," Julian said bitterly. "He had a quarrel with the neighbouring earl, and he built it high enough that a man on horseback could not even see over the top. He wanted to make his point clear to everyone who passed it." He shifted in his saddle, leather creaking beneath him. "I tried to clear it once. When I was 22, he continued, his voice dropping, stripped bare of its usual polish. "I was full of pride and cheap brandy. I had a hunter I believed could fly. I pointed him straight at it, and at the very last moment I hesitated. I pulled the rein only a fraction of an inch." Marin went still, letting Tempest chew at his bit, and listened. "The horse felt my hesitation," Julian said. "He stopped dead. I did not. I went straight over his head, struck the top of the wall, and landed in the rocks beyond it. I shattered my collarbone, broke 3 ribs, and spent 2 days lying in freezing rain before a shepherd finally found me." He finally turned to look at her, his dark eyes bleak, holding a vulnerability he had clearly never shown another living soul. "I bought Tempest because I watched him clear a 6-foot hedge without breaking stride," he said quietly. "I told myself if I owned the one horse capable of conquering this wall, it would somehow erase the fact that I remain completely terrified of it." He let out a short, bitter breath. "I failed the horse the same way I failed that jump." Marin studied the Duke. She saw the heavy chain of his own expectations dragging him down, a man trapped behind a wall entirely of his own making, paralyzed by an old fear he had never let go of. Tempest snorted violently, plunging forward a step, his chest straining against the leather. He was staring at the wall too, ears pricked sharp and forward. He was not afraid of it. He was sizing it up. "You did not fail him," Marin said, her voice cutting through the wind. Julian looked at her, surprised by the edge in her tone. "You handed him to me." She tightened her grip on the reins, feeling the coiled power beneath her shift and gather. Her heart had already begun to race. "You wagered 45 guineas that I could not sit him for 3 minutes, she said. "I did." She turned Tempest in a tight circle, walking him away from the wall to gain a clean line. His stride lengthened the moment he understood what was happening, adrenaline sparking hot through his blood. "I will wager you 90, Marin said, turning back to face him, her eyes bright with something fierce and unshaken. "I will wager that he clears it today." Right now, Julian's breath caught. His gaze swung from her small pale face to the unforgiving stones beyond. "Cobb, no. The wall is too high. The ground is frozen solid. If he refuses, he will crush you against it." "He will not refuse," Marin said, gathering her reins, rising slightly in the stirrups despite the pain flaring through her shoulder, drowned out entirely by the roar of blood in her own ears. "Because I will not hesitate." Julian opened his mouth to forbid it outright, to pull rank and end this before it began, but the words died somewhere in his throat. He saw the terrible clarity written across her face. She was no longer doing this for money. She was doing it to shatter the ghost that had haunted him for over a decade. 90 guineas, he whispered, his knuckles white on his own reins. God help you. Maren did not smile. She squeezed her legs against the horse's massive sides. Let us go, you wretched animal, she breathed, and let the storm off its leash entirely. If watching her actually go for it has you sitting forward in your seat, this is the part where I ask you to hit that like button before we finish. Because the next 60 seconds are exactly why this channel exists, and I would love to see you in the comments once you find out what happens on the other side. Hooves struck the frozen moor like hammers against an anvil. Tempest needed no urging at all. The instant Maren slackened the heavy rein, he surged forward, the acceleration terrifying in its violence. This was not the smooth, rolling gallop of a polished racehorse. This was the raw, piston-driven thrust of a predator closing in on its kill. Every muscle in his body worked in brutal unison, tearing chunks of frost-hardened earth loose and flinging them back into the icy air. The wind ripped Maren's hat away instantly. She did not blink. Her eyes streamed in the biting cold, the air slicing her cheeks like fragments of glass, blurring the edges of her sight. She kept her focus locked entirely on the jagged line of grey stone rushing toward them. Every sense seemed to overload at once. The sharp scent of crushed winter grass, the hot metallic tang of the horse's breath blowing back into her face, mingling with the heavy reek of his sweat, the brutal jolt in her bruised shoulder with every massive stride. Julian watched from 50 yards back, his bay dancing in nervous panic, reacting to the sudden eruption of violence ahead. He fought to keep his own mount steady, his gloved hands numb, his lungs frozen solid in his chest. He was watching what felt like a suicide unfold in front of him. The wall stood too high. The approach lay too uneven. The ground beneath them was a treacherous slope, riddled with hidden rabbit holes. One misplaced hoof, one fraction of hesitation, and a ton of bone and muscle and iron shoe would meet solid granite at full speed. He knew precisely what that sounded like. The memory of his own bones cracking still echoed sickly in his ears. "Do not pull," Julian whispered into the empty air, the ghost of his own old failure choking the words raw in his throat. "For the love of everything, Maren, do not pull." She did not. She felt the exact instant Tempest locked his focus onto the jump, a physical shift rippling through the animal beneath her. His ears flattened against his skull. His stride lengthened, devouring the remaining ground with a predator's single-minded purpose. He was not afraid of the barrier ahead of him. He was furious at it. He intended to conquer those stones simply because they dared to stand in his way. 10 yards, then 5. Maren grabbed a thick handful of mane, pressed her bleeding knuckles into his sweat-soaked neck, and rose slightly in the stirrups. She threw her own heart over that wall first and trusted the rest of him to follow it. Tempest gathered his hindquarters beneath him. The massive coiled muscle bunched tight, and he struck the frozen earth one final time, the sound like a cannon firing out across the empty moor, and launched them both straight into the winter sky. Gravity simply let go. The violent upward thrust tore the breath entirely from Maren's lungs. They kept rising. The world fell silent, the thunder of hooves replaced by the thin, whistling hiss of wind tearing through his stiff mane. Maren looked down. Beneath her right boot, the treacherous, moss-slick top of the wall flashed past in a blur. They were clearing it by mere inches. The bitter, decaying smell of ancient lichen filled her nose, sharp and strange. For one impossible, suspended heartbeat, the two of them flew. Then the world tilted sharply downward, the ground rushing up to meet them. Maren leaned back, slipping the reins through her burning fingers, throwing her weight far behind the saddle to keep them both from somersaulting over his massive neck. Tempest struck the frozen earth on the far side. The impact was catastrophic, shooting straight up Maren's spine, rattling her teeth, nearly throwing her loose entirely. His front knees buckled slightly under the force, his iron shoes scraping wildly against hidden rock beneath the grass. He stumbled, slipping dangerously to one side. Maren lost her right stirrup. She slammed her elbow against his neck to anchor herself, her thighs gripping the stiff saddle flaps with agonizing, cramping force. "Up!" she screamed, her voice cracking raw in the freezing air. Tempest let out a desperate, rattling snort, dug his hind hooves into the frozen ground, found his purchase, and surged upright again, taking 3 massive, uneven strides to recover his balance, tearing long strips of turf loose before slowing into a heavy, shuddering trot. Maren hauled back on the reins, her hands shaking so violently she could barely grip the leather. Tempest finally came to a halt, chest heaving like a bellows. Thick white lather dripping from his neck and flanks, foam streaking the heavy bit in his mouth. They had made it to the other side. Maren slumped forward, resting her forehead against the hot, sweat-slicked curve of his neck. Her heart beat so fast it physically hurt, a frantic bird battering itself against the inside of her ribs. She found herself laughing, though it sounded closer to a sob, a raw, ragged sound made of pure adrenaline and miserable, overwhelming relief. She slowly turned the horse to face back across the wall. Julian sat frozen on his bay, staring at her as though he had just watched a ghost climb out of a fresh grave. The wall stood between them, massive and unmoved, but Maren sat above it now, looking down at him. She did not gloat, she did not smile in triumph. She only wiped a smear of dirt and sweat from her cheek, chest heaving violently, and gave him a single stiff nod. Julian drew a breath that shuddered visibly in the cold, a plume of white smoke rising from his lips. The crushing weight he had carried for over a decade, the shame, the fear, the heavy armor of his own detachment, fractured cleanly down the middle, broken apart by a half-starved woman on a killer horse. Steam rolled off Tempest's flanks in thick, ghostly clouds by the time Maren rode him the 2 miles down along the jagged fence line to the rusted iron gate connecting the South Moor to the main road. Julian was already there, waiting, having dismounted, standing with his bay's reins held tight, staring down at the frozen, rutted dirt at his boots. When he heard the heavy rhythmic thud of Tempest's hooves approaching, he lifted his head. Maren stopped the grey gelding a few feet away. She looked, if anything, worse than the day of the first ride, like a casualty pulled fresh from some quiet battlefield. Her knuckles bled again, fresh red, soaking through the clean linen she had wrapped that very morning. Her lips had cracked and bled in the wind. Her coat had torn at the hem, plastered with mud and coarse horsehair. She did not wait for him to speak. She kicked free of the stirrups and slid off the saddle, and her legs gave out the instant her boots struck frozen earth, the adrenaline crash absolute, turning every muscle in her body to water. Julian dropped his own reins. He moved faster than she had ever once seen him move, closing the distance and catching her under the arms before her knees could hit the ground, his grip almost bruising in its intensity. He did not let go even once she found her footing again. He pulled her hard against the front of his heavy coat, the smell of cedar and tobacco mixing thick with the sharp, acrid scent of her sweat and leather, and the horse's hot breath. "You are entirely out of your mind," Julian breathed, his voice rough, stripped completely of its usual polish. His hands traveled up her arms to grip her shoulders, and she realized with a small shock that he was shaking. The Duke of Eastmoor, who never raised his voice and never once seemed to hurry through his own life, was actually trembling. "You could have died," he said. "He could have clipped a hind leg, broken his neck, and crushed you into the dirt beneath him. But he did not," Maren said, tilting her head back to look at him. Exhaustion sat heavy in every limb, her shoulder screaming fresh pain, but underneath it she felt dangerously, gloriously alive. "He jumped it." "I did not care about the horse," Julian said harshly. The words hung suspended in the freezing air, heavy and absolute. Maren stared at him, seeing the dark, frantic intensity burning in his eyes. This was not the bored nobleman who had once told her to take her business to the kitchens. This was a man stripped down entirely to raw nerve. She swallowed hard, tasting the lingering copper of blood in her mouth. She was not accustomed to men looking at her this way, Men usually looked at her with pity, with disgust, or with something cheap and hungry. Julian looked at her as though she were the one solid thing left standing in a room that was caving in around him. 200 guineas, Marin whispered, a defensive reflex, a cynical shield thrown up against the sudden, terrifying closeness of the moment. She did not know how to be valued like this. Julian let out a low, ragged laugh that held no real amusement in it at all, sounding instead like pure relief, tearing loose from somewhere deep in his chest. He slid one gloved hand from her shoulder up to the back of her neck, fingers tangling gently into her cold, tangled hair. "I will pay you 200 guineas, he said, his voice dropping to a fierce, low murmur, his face only inches from hers now. "I will pay you 10,000 if that is what it takes, but I am not letting you walk off this estate. You are keeping the position." "I am keeping the horse as well," Marin countered, her breath catching slightly as his thumb brushed the fading yellow bruise still marking her cheekbone. "He is yours," Julian agreed, without a single second of hesitation. He always was. Marin looked at his mouth. She did not want a rescuer. She had spent her entire life fighting against the heavy, grasping hands of men who believed their money entitled them to her obedience. She did not want a lord, and she certainly did not believe in fairy tales. But she wanted this particular man, the one who had knelt in the mud and handed her the means to survive entirely on her own terms. She reached up, gripping the heavy wool lapels of his ruined coat with her battered, bloodied hands, and pulled him down to her. The kiss that followed was not gentle. It was not polite, and it was certainly not soft. It tasted of dirt and adrenaline and biting winter cold. Julian wrapped his arms tight around her waist, pulling her flush against him, kissing her back with a desperate, bruising hunger of his own. It felt like an anchor finally dropped into rough water. They were two deeply cynical, deeply damaged people who had spent their whole lives bracing for the next fall, only to discover they had hit solid ground at last. When they finally broke apart, both of them breathing hard, Marin rested her forehead against his chest. The steady, heavy rhythm of his heart thudded loud against her ear through the wool of his coat. Nearby, Tempest snorted violently, tossing his massive head, tearing a mouthful of dead, frozen grass from the ditch, entirely unbothered by the two humans beside him. Julian let out a long breath, resting his chin against the top of her head, looking from the great grey beast down to the ruined, remarkable woman still in his arms. "Tomorrow," he said softly, a trace of his old dry humor finally creeping back into his voice, "you are going to teach me how to ride him myself." Marin let out a genuine raspy laugh that warmed the freezing air between them. "Tomorrow," she said, stepping back just far enough to meet his eyes directly, her grin sharp and a little wicked. "We start you on the ponies, Your Grace. I have no intention of breaking your neck and being left here to deal with the paperwork. If a story about mud and grit and two stubborn people finally meeting in the middle is exactly the kind of thing that gets you through a long week, this is your moment. Hit like on your way out. Leave a comment telling me whether you would have jumped that wall yourself. Share it with somebody who loves a good underdog, and subscribe so the next one lands in front of you the second it goes up.